this. So I had the privilege of listening to Dr. Nina Hood here at our school, at Rotorua Junior High School, not so long ago, and the value was immediate, and it was such a fantastic talk and a good time. So I invited her to talk with both of our associations. Just as Janine, if you wouldn't mind, there you go. Just as a bit of an introduction for Nina, Nina is a trained secondary school teacher, having taught at Epsom Girls Grammar and Mount Roskill in Auckland. She undertook a MSc with distinction in learning and technology and a PhD in education at the University of Oxford. She was a senior lecturer at the Auckland University, and she continues to work closely with the Education Hub and as an Education Hub founder. And she contributes to the strategic direction and undertakes special research reports for the organization. She's going to be talking to us today a little bit about the science of education. So Nina, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. Kia ora tātou. It's lovely to be here this afternoon. I am going to attempt to share my screen and hope that all works. So I hope that you can all see that. So as Alex said, I am here to talk to you this afternoon about the science of learning. And when I told a colleague of mine that I was going to be talking to you all this afternoon, his first question to me was, well, do you know anything about technology? To which I said, no, absolutely no, pretty much nothing other than what I managed to glean taking it as an option for a couple of years at school. But I do hope that some of what I talk about today will have applicability to you and your roles as technology teachers. And I think, you know, we're hearing a lot about the science of learning, particularly from the government at the moment. But hopefully what I'll be able to do for you today is to sort of break it down and give you my interpretation of what the science of learning can offer teachers, and also some of the potential limitations of it, or the limits of what it can offer as well. And I will also hopefully give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have at the end, either via the chat, or you can just ask me at the end of the presentation. So I'll make sure that I leave a bit of time for that as well. And now I'm just trying to get my mouse onto my other screen so I can move forward, which it doesn't want to do, which is not very helpful. That's not helpful either. Hold on, I will sort myself out in just a second with any luck, or I will just have to disconnect from the screen and make it work down here, which I think I'm going to have to do. Sorry, bear with me. I mean, honestly, it's awful. I'm talking to digital technology specialists, and I seem to be particularly challenged in that area myself. I will try to get my video back at some point in time. Right. There we go. So the science of learning, from my point of view, essentially it summarizes the research that exists on the cognitive processes of how we learn as humans, and really tries to connect it to the practical implications of what this means in classroom settings for teaching and learning. But I think what I would say about any research is that it's constantly evolving. We're constantly developing our understandings of what it can actually offer us, and that research only ever provides us with a sort of direction of travel. It's never going to tell us exactly what we should do in any given situation. It can only give us ideas, and it's always up to teachers as the professionals, as the experts within their context, to make judgment calls about how they utilize it and the degree to which they utilize it. A concept that's been really valuable for me in terms of my own journey with understanding the research on the science of learning, or how we learn, is something called the learning trajectory. And essentially, if we look at this diagram, if we look at that box, deep level 3, that is where we ultimately want to get all of our students to. So students who have the ability to be able to apply the knowledge that they've learned, to be able to transfer what they've learned into new contexts, to solve novel problems. However, what the science of learning research really clearly tells us is whilst deep level 3 might be that end destination where we're wanting to get to, what's really important is that we support students through all of these stages before they can get to that ability to actually apply and transfer their knowledge. And that what needs to happen before they can get there is they need to actually build a really solid knowledge base and understanding of a topic before they're able to engage in more sort of complex thinking skills or higher order thinking skills in relation to that particular topic. And I think sometimes where we might have gone wrong, or where we sometimes get clashes in education, is that people are talking about different stages of this learning trajectory. And not recognizing that all of them are actually important. It's just we've got to get that order right in order to support students to be learning or learning most efficiently and effectively. So when we think about the science of learning literature, and particularly when we think about how it's being used at the moment in a lot of the policy decision making, we're really focusing in on that surface level learning and that deep level 1 learning. And that's around the learning of basic facts, basic skills, and building that initial knowledge base. And that's why we hear so much discussion about how memory works, because what we know is that in order to be able to solve novel problems, in order to be able to engage in higher order thinking skills, we need to know a huge amount about that topic first, in order to be able to then use that information in order to solve those problems. And so essentially, when we think about how our memory works, we can break it down into 2 key parts. Our working memory, which is where all processing occurs. So that's where we process any new information that we encounter, but also where we bring information from our long-term memory and actually use it to solve new problems. So it's where that processing element happens. And the key thing that we know about our working memory is that it is defined by its limited capacity. And that's limited capacity in relation to 2 key things. That's the amount of new information it can hold in any one point in time. So there's only a little bit of information, new information it can hold. And also it's limited in terms of how long it can hold that information for. And so that's why, you know, if someone spouts out a telephone number that just immediately, you might remember it for a minute or so. It's unlikely if someone came back to you in an hour's time the following day that you're going to remember it. However, if you're like me, you can probably still remember a lot of phone numbers from your childhood, and that's because you used them so much that they actually got encoded into your long-term memory. And once something's in your long-term memory, it's stored there essentially semi-permanently. And what we really want to be focusing on in those early stages of teaching students about a particular topic or about a particular skill is we want to focus on encoding that new information that they're learning, or encoding those new skills that they're learning into the long-term memory. And the best way to do this is through giving them lots of opportunity to practice what we call retrieving that information that they've learned. So lots of opportunities to encounter that new information again. And this is where my knowledge of technology or my lack of knowledge about technology is going to become really apparent. But I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that as part of at least some parts of technology, you're teaching students quite a few skills. And that, you know, or procedural skills. So you're going to be doing activities that require students to go through multiple steps in order to accomplish something. And what we know about how the memory works, how we learn, is that this process applies just as much to learning dates in history or learning your times tables as it does to learning procedural skills. And that actually, and I'm hoping that this may resonate for at least some of you, that actually what we need to think about when we're teaching students new skills is how we present that information and how we give them lots of opportunities to practice engaging in those skills, giving them lots of feedback on that for them to be able to remember it. And it works in exactly the same way when we're learning a skill. And it's the same thing when we're learning, say, a new sport or learning how to do a physical activity as well, is that it takes us practice in order, and what we really want to get to is a process of automaticity, so that students can just do a lot of these fundamental skills or use this fundamental knowledge without having to rely on their working memory anymore. So, and this is where, I mean, honestly, it's a bit of an embarrassment that I'm talking to technology teachers, but I'm going to hope that some of you teach textiles, because that's something I know a little bit about. And I was thinking about, the process of just teaching a child how to thread a sewing machine and to set up a sewing machine ready to sew. There are a number of different steps involved in that. And the first time you try to do that, it actually takes a huge amount of work. If you're anything like me, and this is going back a number of years, when I was learning to set up my sewing machine, I had to follow step-by-step instructions to do it. And then the next time I came to do it, I actually had to go back to those instructions and follow them again because I couldn't quite remember. But now if I was coming to a sewing machine, I can set it up really, really quickly because I know how to do it. And the great thing about that is that because I can set it up so quickly, I actually don't even need to think about doing that work. I can just do that in a heartbeat and get straight into sewing. Whereas for a student who's just starting out on that process, they have to go through so many different steps. They have to remember so many different steps in order to get to the point where they can even start sewing, let alone think about all the other things that they have to take into consideration when they actually want to sew something. And so that's one of the things that is really key about those early stages of the learning process, and what cognitive science tells us is that as teachers, we want to be really careful about the amount of cognitive load we're placing on our students when they're learning something new. So cognitive load theory or cognitive overload are words that are thrown around quite a lot at the moment. And I can tell you that when the new curriculum comes out, or the refreshed, reviewed, whatever type of curriculum we want to call it, cognitive load is definitely going to be in there. But essentially what it tells us is that when someone is a novice or new to learning about a particular topic or undertaking a particular skill, we need to be really mindful about how much new learning they do at once. Because when you're new at something, it takes you a lot longer to engage in that learning, and you're engaging in the learning in a very different way and at a much lower level of complexity to experts on that particular topic. And when we think about not overloading students, we want to think about both the complexity of the new information or the new skills that we're asking them to do. And we also want to think about not putting too much what we call extraneous load or unnecessary or distracting detail in there. So focusing really carefully on the key things that it is that students need to know. So if we sort of think about how the science of learning is really very generally portrayed in education, it is very much focused on those cognitive processes of learning new knowledge or new skills. So it's on this part of the diagram, sort of the cognitive processes involved in how we learn. But what we also know is that there are a whole number of factors that actually influence a student's ability to be able to engage in learning. So whilst the cognitive processes involved in learning are the same across just about every student, I think the group of people where there may be some cognitive differences or in the processes are people who have a brain injury. But as far as the science tells us, for everyone else, those cognitive processes are the same. However, these influences on learning are going to change across different students. And I'm just going to spend a bit of time unpacking those and discussing what those mean. So first of all, what's called our cognitive schemas that's honestly just a fancy term for how much we know. The information that's stored in our long-term memory influences both what and how quickly we learn. So this diagram is meant to be read as two rows. The top row denotes an individual who has a really strong existing schema. They have a lot of prior information or knowledge on a particular topic, and that's denoted by those grey triangles. And this means that when they encounter new information or have to add additional skills on top of a base skill that they actually have something to connect it to. And it means that then when they receive even more information on that topic, again, it can slot down and make a really neat pyramid because you're always connecting what you're learning to what you already know. In contrast, in that bottom row is an individual who doesn't have that really strong base schema or that really strong underlying knowledge, so that when they receive that same information, they actually have nothing to connect it to. And then when they receive even more information on that topic, it basically just crumbles. And because they don't have the ability to make those connections between what they're learning and what they already know. And the way that I find quite useful to explain it is to imagine that you're at a social gathering and there's a group of people engaged in conversation and you go up to join the conversation, but you're joining it partway through. And it often takes several minutes before you actually can really understand what they're talking about. And quite often you have to ask a couple of questions to make sense of it. And that's not because you don't understand the words that they're saying. It's because you don't have the broader context of what came before in the conversation to enable you to make sense of what you're learning. And that's exactly what it's like for students in your class who don't have that base knowledge on a particular topic. They don't have the frame of reference for being able to actually make sense of it. And so one of the key things we know is making sure that we understand where students are at in their learning on a particular topic is critically important to enabling them to then progress in that learning. Similarly, the research really clearly tells us that emotions, executive functioning, and motivation make a real difference to an individual's ability to learn. So if you've got students in your classes who have just had a really bad day, they might have had a disagreement with their parents before they left for school that morning, they might not have had a good night's sleep the night before, whole range of different things, that is going to impact their ability to learn that day. So how we're feeling influences our ability to learn. Similarly, and this is, we've got lots of New Zealand-based research to illustrate and emphasize this second point, but students learn best when they feel a strong sense of social connection and a sense of belonging to those around them. And what the research tells us is that students need that sense of connection to other students, and they also critically need it to at least one other adult within the school environment. Similarly, executive functioning skills influence our ability to learn. So executive functioning has three key elements to it. One is cognitive flexibility, so the ease of moving between different tasks. The second is working memory, which goes back to what we talked about before, so that processing of new information. And the second is around inhibitory control and self-regulation. So that's the ability to delay gratification, to not get distracted by the person who's sitting beside you talking to you, the ability to stay on task and concentrate. And what we know is that the executive functioning skills of students can differ wildly. Also, I'm guessing most of you probably are secondary school teachers or intermediate and secondary school teachers. And one of the sad things is that whilst there are things that we can do to improve executive functioning skills in older students, actually the best time to intervene in executive functioning skills is between the ages of 3 and 6. So really early childhood and those first years of primary school are when we can really set that foundation there. And finally, motivation influences learning, but also is influenced by learning. So students who are more motivated are more likely to engage in learning, but similarly, students who experience greater levels of success are more likely to be motivated. And what we know is that there are some students in our schools who very rarely actually get to experience success. And success doesn't need to be on a huge scale all the time. But what we know is that students need to be experiencing some degree of success every single day that they're at school, no matter how small that might be, in order to be able to maintain that motivation. We also know that motivation comes when students have three key needs met. So the first is a feeling of competence. So that's around this self-efficacy and their belief that they are actually able to learn. The second is relatedness, and this goes back to the idea of the social connection. And the third is autonomy, and that's students feeling like they have some degree of choice in their learning. And that's not the idea that, you give children free rein and they can learn whatever they want, however they want, but it's about controlled choice and thinking about how we can give students some degree of controlled choice each day. And I'm really sorry, that's my child coming in. Give me 2 seconds and I will sort him out. Thanks, Georgie. Out you go. Apologies. So giving students some degree of controlled choice, and actually having a 3-year-old come in is one of the best ways to explain controlled choice, because actually what you would do with a 3-year-old in terms of, say getting them dressed in the morning is exactly what the sort of same principle that you'd want to use with secondary school students. So for instance, if you're getting a 3-year-old dressed, really poor idea in my experience to give them free rein to decide what they want to wear. You say, would you like to wear the blue shorts or the red shorts? And they feel like they have a degree of choice in the matter, whereas both options are completely acceptable to you as a parent. And that's the same thing that we want to be providing students with in their school experience. So if I come back to this diagram, sort of thinking about where the science of learning fits in terms of sort of the broader scope of teaching and learning and education. So we've looked at the cognitive processes, we've looked at some of the key influences on learning. I think it's also now really interesting to explore exactly what the science of learning can and can't offer us in terms of principles for teaching, and focusing really in on ideas around curriculum and ideas around pedagogy. So in terms of curriculum, and I think it's really important to emphasize here is that the science of learning is not a theory of curriculum. It is to do with how we learn. So what it tells us is that we should have a curriculum that's knowledge rich, because the more that students know, the more that they can know. So having a strong basis of knowledge, including both content knowledge and skills in a curriculum, is really important. We know that having a coherent curriculum, and a curriculum that's structured so that students work up and slowly build up their knowledge and slowly build up the sophistication with which they can engage with that knowledge, is really important. We also want a curriculum that leads to valued outcomes. But so whilst the science of learning can tell us about those principles, there's also a lot that it can't tell us. So it can't tell us what knowledge or at what degree of depth we should be teaching that knowledge. It doesn't often tell us when particular knowledge or skills should be taught, or the order necessarily that they should be taught in. And it certainly doesn't tell us what the end point of schooling is, or what the purpose of education is. That's something that sits outside of it. And I think it's really important for all teachers to realize that whilst the science of learning is valuable, it isn't going to answer all the questions that we have about education or provide us with everything that we need to know. On the pedagogy side, the science of learning does provide us with some quite clear guidance on how we want to teach when we're at the beginning of the learning trajectory. So when we're just starting out teaching students about a new topic or developing a new set of skills. And what it does clearly tell us is that in these instances, something called explicit instruction or explicit teaching is definitely the most efficient way of teaching students, and is often the most effective way of teaching students. And I think sometimes explicit instruction gets a bit of a bad rap, and also gets misunderstood. So if we think about it, here's sort of and this is designed to essentially be read as 3 rows going across in terms of the order that we do it in. But when we're talking about what explicit instruction is, essentially what it is it's about being really clear about what it is that we want students to be learning. It's about breaking up new information or breaking up new skills into chunks so that we're not overloading students' working memory when they're just starting out on a topic. It's about providing really clear explanations for students about what it is we're wanting them to know and be able to do. It's about being interactive between teachers and students. So it's not just a teacher standing at the front of the room just talking to students. There's a high level of dialogue and interaction, in particular, so that teachers can actually check for understanding, make sure that their students know what it is that they're meant to be doing, meant to be learning, and helping them with making sure that they are progressing in that learning journey. We know that one of the most effective ways of actually supporting students to learn new information and to understand what's expected of them is to provide models and worked examples, and then give them lots of opportunities to practice putting those in place, practice undertaking new skills, practice using new information that they're learning. And when they're just starting out in that practice, we want to make sure that we're scaffolding them in it. So we're not just throwing them out there and letting them do it without providing support that they need, and then providing them the opportunity to get to that independent practice. And one of the things, and actually it's going to come up a little bit later on as well, but I think one of the things that's quite interesting, and I mean, again, showing my ignorance of all things technology, but one of the things I think is that when we talk about explicit instruction and the different steps and stages that it involves, in many ways, it mimics quite closely the apprenticeship model that goes back, essentially, well, at least to the Middle Ages and probably before, in terms of the apprenticeship model was essentially how most people learned, and it was how they learned their craft or their skill. And if we think about the way that that worked, it is very similar to the explicit instruction approach. So it was about the master, the teacher, clearly showing and providing a model for their apprentice of what it is that they wanted. It was around breaking tasks into small chunks and giving the apprentice a chance to learn those specific skills and to practice those skills and to build up their proficiency in those skills before then moving on to the next component. And I think we can see quite a lot of similarities between that apprenticeship model that's been around for hundreds of years and what's happening in explicit instruction. So if we come back to this diagram and we've looked at the cognitive processes of how we learn, influences on learning, some of the implications of the science of learning for curriculum and pedagogy, I think there's still another piece that needs to happen between that and actually how you translate that into practice. And I think when we talk about the science of learning and what it can offer us, it can only ever offer us principles of sort of high-level principles of how we can approach aspects of teaching and learning. But it doesn't necessarily tell us huge amounts about exactly what that looks like when we're implementing it in the classroom. And definitely in many subject areas, I guess the subject where we've got the most evidence is around actually teaching children to read. And that's where we can get quite specific about particular practices. But even then, there is a huge level of teacher judgment that needs to go on in terms of the ability to adapt those particular practices to the specific children that are in front of the teacher. But if we come back to this learning trajectory or stages of learning and look at it in relation to cognitive load and the science of learning literature, really interestingly, the science of learning literature tells us that whilst explicit instruction is a really effective teaching pedagogy for surface level learning and deep level 1, which is absolutely critical and is an essential part of students' learning, it actually becomes less effective as students learn more and develop greater expertise around a particular topic. And then once we get into deep level 2, deep level 3 learning, actually we want to be reducing the amount of explicit instruction that we're doing and providing students with rich tasks that require them to solve problems and to engage in higher order thinking skills. So I think, and sometimes we get into a debate in New Zealand about, well, you should only be doing explicit instruction or you should only be doing inquiry learning. Whereas what the research really clearly tells us is that we need both. But critically, we need to make sure that we give students enough of that explicit guided practice before we then let them go into that more inquiry style learning, so that they actually have the knowledge and skills that they need in order to be able to successfully engage in richer, more authentic tasks. What we also know is that when we're designing learning opportunities, we need to think really carefully about where in a child's learning they're at. And where in their development they're at. And what we know is that over a child's time at school, so from the ages of sort of 5 to 18-ish, they generally are going to go through 3 stages of development. So when they're first entering primary school, and those first couple of years of primary school, they're still very much in an exploration stage. And, and that's why we know that that playful environment, giving young children plenty of opportunities to engage in play, to engage with a really rich environment, is critically important, because that is one of the key ways that they are understanding and exploring their world. I think sometimes we can take that too far and we forget that actually there needs to be a really intentional adult within that situation so that that adult can support and scaffold that learning and take it further. But we know that one of the primary ways that children learn is through exploration and is through play. Around the age of sort of around 7 or 8, and obviously there is a degree of difference across different children, but generally, around that age, there's actually a developmental shift for children, and they start to move out of that exploration stage. And it's not to say that play is not really important. The research clearly tells us that play in different forms is critical for all of us, even when we're in adulthood. But actually what starts to happen is they move into more of a mastery phase. And this is actually where that apprentice style of teaching becomes incredibly valuable for these children. That again, you want a really rich environment, really rich resources, lots of opportunities for the students to be observing teachers modeling particular practices, and then them slowly taking them, picking them up, trying them themselves. We then know that around about the age of 13, again, give or take, so generally sort of where we're starting to get students transferring into the secondary school setting, again, there's another developmental shift. And at that age, what we're seeing is students being able to really grapple with and understand more abstract concepts and more abstract ideas. And again, this enables them to engage in a different type of learning. There's opportunities for new types of pedagogy to emerge. And what we also know is that at that stage, students are more able to really engage in metacognitive strategies, self-regulatory skills in terms of their learning. And it doesn't mean that they can't do that in the earlier stages. It just means that once they start to get that little bit older, it is easier for them to engage in those particular, develop those skills and engage in slightly different learning opportunities as well. So we need to be really aware of, as teachers, of where students are at in terms of their development, and also recognizing that particularly if you're sort of in that sort of early years of secondary school, you'll have students that are actually spanning quite a range in terms of their development and the types of learning that they're actually ready for. I think I'm going to miss that slide because it's probably slightly less useful for technology teachers compared to some other disciplines. But I do want to talk about this, and this is, you'll be happy to know, my final slide, and I will then stop talking and give you the chance to ask any questions, because I do actually realise the deep irony in me giving a presentation like this on science of learning, where I am just talking at you in a way that doesn't align with any of the principles of the science for learning. So I do apologise. I'm very happy to make this PowerPoint presentation available to whomever might want it afterwards. But I will just quickly talk about the work of Richard Elmore, because it is really fascinating work. And what Elmore contends is that essentially, he has a big focus on the nature of tasks that students do. And essentially what he contends is that it's the tasks that students are given to do on a day-to-day basis that is ultimately going to determine the nature of the learning that they engage with and the outcomes that they get from education. And what he would suggest, and there is some New Zealand research to suggest that this is the case in New Zealand as well, is that too many students only ever encounter really low-level tasks as part of their schooling, and they get very few opportunities to actually engage in really rich tasks. And he did a fascinating study where he worked with a group of researchers, and they went out into schools, and they went into schools that had multiple classes at the same year level, and they were schools, it was based in America, where the teachers were all teaching essentially the same lesson on the same day. And they went to observe these teachers in the classroom. And the teachers were meant to all be teaching the same thing. But what the researchers found was that actually the nature of the learning that students were getting, the opportunities that they had to learn, as a direct connection to how the teachers were teaching, the nature of the tasks that they were being given, differed wildly. And that some children were having really rich learning opportunities, whereas others were only ever getting a very shallow level of learning. And so I think it's really important to think about the nature of the tasks that students are doing and ensuring that they get really rich opportunities to learn as part of their schooling experience.
Absolutely.
I am going to leave it there, but I would love to be able to answer any questions. I will stop sharing, but can start. I can put up any bit of the PowerPoint at any stage if that would be useful. But if anyone has any questions, thoughts, considerations, please do let me know. And I see that B. Smith has a hand raised.
Thank you, Nina. Appreciate it. My question maybe is something science of learning doesn't directly address, but it's related to what you said about before, how you realize that you're talking about science of learning and you're conveying it in this very presentation style, so on and so forth, and you apologize for that. And my question is, my feeling is perhaps some of the reason that we do these things, like present slides and lecture and just try to cram a whole bunch of information, is that it appears that we can get through a lot of information quickly, not just putting it out there, but hopefully a lot of that can be downloaded or assimilated by or taken on by students as well. Whereas if you go develop tasks that might go deeper into learning, there's a sacrifice in the maybe the breadth of learning or something. Can you speak to that?
Oh, it's such a great question. So yes, I can. So I think there are a couple of parts to that. So you're absolutely right. I think we often will do a lecture or we'll talk and sort of try to get as much information in there because we think that we are able to get more information out. But actually the reality is, whilst we may be sharing a lot of information, there's a massive difference between just sharing information and someone learning it, right? And so in the long run, we're actually really doing our students a disservice if we're not giving them those opportunities to actually stop and engage with those specific bits of information and those specific tasks. I do apologize. It would appear that all hell is breaking loose in my household this afternoon. The second part of the question, such a great question, and there's a really interesting tension in whenever we're designing teaching and learning, whenever we're designing curricula, between breadth and depth. And I mean, I don't know if you'll be pleased to know, or it will, make you distraught to know that actually no one has an answer to that question, right? Of how broad should a curriculum be versus how much depth should we go into in any given topic. And there's always going to be a tension and there's always going to be a balancing act. But there is actually no easy answer to it at all. And there's always going to be trade-offs depending on how we make decisions about that as well. And attention. for teachers. So I'm really sorry, I haven't really answered that question, but only to say that it's a great point and there's no straightforward, easy answer to it.
I appreciate that. I'm happy with I don't know. That's a solid answer.
I've just had a question through in the chat about the usefulness of solo taxonomy. So yeah, I think it is useful, and I think any taxonomy is really useful in terms of thinking about how sort of the complexity of learning develops over time. So, and you know, solo is one type of taxonomy. There's Bloom's taxonomy. There's a lot of different taxonomies out there. So what I would say is, yes, useful. I think the key thing is just making sure that you get a really solid base and foundation before you then start going up into those more sophisticated thinking skills and approaches.
I think something that came up in conversation last time we did this talk as well was the similarity between solo taxonomy and the learning taxonomy that you offered at the start of the lesson as well. And your four levels of learning taxa there is roughly indicating each of those solo, relational, extended, abstract towards the end, of course, and things like that. I'm just looking through the questions that I wrote down, and they're all, how do I do this? How do I do this part? How do I manage this part? So what are the specific implementations? What are some of the success stories you've seen that is like the lowest hanging fruit, a deliberate action that teachers can take away and actually go and implement that really hones at least some parts of this theory?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I mean, I do think that there's lots to gain from explicit instruction and thinking about how you break learning down into particular chunks, give students opportunities to practice, to understand them, to practice them, to get feedback on them, and then to connect them into other areas. And I think sometimes, and again, I mean, I don't know technology. I was a classics and social studies teacher. So, but I think, you know, if I think back to my teaching in those subjects, I think sometimes I could go way too fast, or I could make assumptions that I thought all students knew something when they really didn't. And the result of that is that, you know, I was ultimately shortchanging some of the students in my class because I didn't go back and fill in some of those gaps or make sure that they had that foundation before we went further on. So I do think that there's value in that. But I think so much of it is about, it's still putting a lot of work on the individual teacher to be able to actually think about how those principles apply in that particular context.
I'm sorry, Nathan, if you wouldn't mind putting yourself on mute there. I think you've got some noise coming through.
Are you ready for me?
Yeah, Malcolm, go for it. And then Trevor, I'll come back to your question because great question.
Sure.
But Malcolm, go for it.
Awesome. I was just thinking, I'm actually reassured by a lot of what you've just said today, because a lot of it is kind of common sense. But I just wanted to say that we shouldn't really be afraid to do what we're doing. That's kind of like a little kind of statement that we're doing. But also, it's a little bit of an opinion thing. What do you think is the reason why some students find it hard to engage with independent learning? Or is it like, for example, too much pressure from the elements of curriculum and introducing new bits of curriculum? Or is it down to pressures that schools need to achieve NCA levels and all that kind of stuff? What's your thoughts on that?
So on students engaging in independent learning.
Yeah.
So
as a way to kind of, just make it easier for kids to learn. Yeah. So
my view is that if a student doesn't know a huge amount about a topic, really hard to engage in independent learning, particularly as a teenager. And that in order to be able to engage in independent learning, you have to have pretty strong self-regulatory skills, because you need to be able to know if the approach you're taking is not actually working for you. But you don't just need to know that. You also then need to know what the other approaches are that you could be taking in order to be able to support your learning. And self-regulatory skills take time to develop. And it's something that teachers can be supporting students with, but it's not something that's just innate for most students. They actually need support to be able to learn those. And what we often find with independent learning is that until you know something on a topic, it is really hard to know exactly what it is you should be doing or knowing how to structure that learning process. So the students need a lot of direction in terms of how to do it. It's not just a sudden, you can go off and do it. I don't know if that's answered.
Yeah, it kind of has, because I mean the kind of reason why I've asked that, because I've worked in secondary and I'm currently working in intermediate, so I can see that for me, I've always thought I can understand that some of my students have not had any prior knowledge. So for me, it's like what I'm looking at my practice. I think, what prior knowledge do my kids need to know now in year 7 and 8, so that when they go to high school and if they do digital technologies, for example, what's going to be, if they're revisiting some area, it's like, oh, okay, I've done that before. Because for me, that I find that quite important. That they have to have some kind of prior knowledge, so when they go to it, it's not alien to them when they revisit it a year, 2 years later.
Absolutely. And oh, Malcolm, honestly, like, you make my heart sing with that, because one of the things that would be so wonderful if we could do, and we may get there with what they're doing with the curriculum at the moment, but we want to be doing that backwards mapping, right? Is what is it that the students need to be learning now, and how's it going to connect to learning that they're going to do in 1 year's time, 2 years' time, so that we make sure that they have that base. Absolutely. We haven't historically been particularly good at that in New Zealand.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. That's kind of why I think I do what I do, and I kind of have free reign to a certain extent to do what I do, and that's one of the things I recognize. I had that in my head for the last 5, 6, 7 years. So I try and put that into practice as much as I can.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Trevor, great question. What are my thoughts on assessment? That would entirely depend on what sort of assessment you're talking about. So if you're talking about formative day-to-day assessment, I'd say it's absolutely essential. And, when we talk about that type of assessment, that's as simple as observing how your students are getting on in the classroom, having a conversation with your students to see what they're getting on, how they're getting on with different things, what they might be struggling with, where they need to go next. I think we need way more of that. And that is the most valuable type of assessment that we have. What do I think about, I'm going to go with, was there a summative assessment element of that? What do I think about that? Yeah, indeed. So Gert Biester, who's an educational philosopher, talks a lot about the purpose of education, and he thinks that there are 3 key purposes of education. So one is around accreditation. So the idea that children are going to school in order to gain some sort of accreditation that they can then take on for whatever they do after school. Then there's an element of socialization, so learning to be part of a group and a culture and a society. And then there's individualization, so the idea of developing as the individual. So if we take that first purpose of education, of accreditation, there's got to be some form of assessment to facilitate that accreditation at the end of schooling, to be able to show what it is that students are able to know and able to do. I'm not convinced that what we're currently doing in terms of summative assessment necessarily fits with what I would see as being I don't think it always shows what all students know and are able to do. So I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a huge amount of work still to be done on assessment and what that looks like. And I have some thoughts, but I definitely don't have fully formed answers on that. Mike.
Do you think that a large part of the way we assess is portfolio, that we're starting to go away towards what you think assessment could look like summatively?
Yep, I do. Big fan of portfolios. So yes, I think that approach absolutely is getting much closer to sort of what I think really valuable assessment can be. you know, I also think that there's a really interesting question to be asking about, you know, the whole of how we structure schooling from the, you know, what are the non-negotiables that every single child leaving our schooling system absolutely has to know and being able to do. And, you know, my view is that they have to be numerate, they have to be literate, and we have to be able to show that they are. But then where are the opportunities for students to then have opportunities to dig into what it is that they want to know and be able to do, and to be able to track some of their own pathway as well. But yes, portfolio is great.
Nina,
Yes.
I'm going to read out my comment here. Just a follow-up question about breadth versus depth. Is there a different approach for breadth of learning, if that's what we're aiming for, rather than depth, according to the science of learning?
Yeah, I think there probably is actually. Because I think if you just went purely for breadth across the whole curriculum, you would never really be getting to those deep level 2, deep level 3 elements of learning, right? Because you'd be just focused on, you know, just getting the kids to know the content, be able to do the skills, but you'd never be real. It's when we get into depth, that's when we're really delving deeper into, well, what does this knowledge mean? How can we utilize this skill in more creative ways to solve new problems? So yes, I think there would be differences in the nature of the learning that's taking place. Does that answer the question?
Sort of. So then does the science, at least certainly what you've conveyed to us this afternoon, has more to do with depth of learning and rich learning experiences. But if our aim was over the course of a period, a week, however long, to just go for breadth of learning, if that's our aim in an educational situation, does the science of learning say anything about that and how that might differently, you know, you've mentioned some things about going from one level of deepness, level 1 deepness, using some explicit teaching over to you know, level 3 deeper learning. Is there, do they touch on, oh, you know, if a teacher is just trying to get across a lot of information, perhaps like we did today, is there any science on that, or not really? That's probably just intuitive to us.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is a huge amount on it. I mean, if you just focusing on getting a lot across, and that's all you do across all your lessons, then it is always going to be quite shallow in terms of what you're able to do. What I would say about the learning trajectory as well is that, you know, we look at that across a whole topic. So it's going across multiple, like not even just a week's worth of lessons, really. We're talking about, you know, a term's worth of lessons in terms of how that would stretch out. And there are going to be times within a topic that you're going back and forth across the different levels as well. It's not like it's always just a linear trajectory either.
Thank you.
Kate, feel free to email me to find out where we can get information from the slides. I have no idea what was on slide 8, but I'd be delighted to be able to help.
I was just thinking, Nina, with technology education, it's always a handful for the ministry and the likes to do work in this area with curriculum and assessment, because we have so many different disciplines under that umbrella. And even within those disciplines, there's so many different contexts that the students can work within. And I'm thinking about your, you know, you talk about explicit learning. There are things that we all do, whether it be Digitech, textiles, that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering, yeah, we really need to support maybe primary sector, or, you know, the whole learning pathway of our students. What's explicit in technology? You know, I'm not a big fan of progression of assessment and progression of learning. You know, there's certain chunks that can happen at certain times, but I am starting to see a bit of sense in that regardless of the context, regardless of the discipline, we solve issues, we research to get information, we work with materials or components or programs. Yeah, it's really good to sit here and listen to this, because you know, I've got those base building blocks and your little bits of information that you've peppered onto us today. It's starting to form a picture in my head of how science of learning can really help our thinking, and how we can probably support the primary sector, and or look at a more longitudinal approach to education in our learning area.
Well,
'Cause it
I'm
is-
glad it's been useful, but I think there's huge scope for that. Not least because if you think about primary schools, right, is that they're staffed, I mean, it's so hard, they're staffed by generalists. So, you know, most primary schools don't have a technology expert within their school. And, you know, you've got individual teachers having to teach 8 learning areas. It's huge. So, yeah, I mean, being able to provide some degree of support of, and also, you know, what are the critical things that you'd really love your primary school students to be engaging with and developing, so that when they came into the secondary context, they have at least something there. Alex, you have a hand up.
I do. Could I dig into what you mean when you say that science of learning is not a theory of curriculum? Because
Yeah.
it would seem in a naive view that you would listen to what you have to say and you go, okay, well, we're designing a course, or we're designing a curricula, or we are deciding what we want our students to know. That you go, okay, well, these are the stages of development, and we want some explicit instruction, and so we should be looking at X, Y, and Z instead of, well, we're only teaching 7s and 8s, or we're only teaching younger kids. Maybe we're not too concerned about the deeper understanding of the things that tend to come in the later stages of development. Would you respond to that?
Yeah, I can. So, I mean, I guess my comment about the science of learning not being a curriculum theory or a theory of curriculum essentially is at times, and this is coming across in the New Zealand context in some situations, there's this idea of, you know, we've got a science of learning curriculum. Your curriculum's defined by the science of learning. And I'd say the science of learning talks to how we learn, right? And so therefore, actually, if anything, it's going to influence pedagogy far more than it is going to influence curriculum.
Okay.
So I think it's just, so that's where that comment particularly was coming from, was that, you know, it's never, the science of learning is never going to give us answers. I mean, it tells us at a very high level that we want that structure and we want sequence and we want a degree of progression, but it doesn't tell us a lot more than that. And even some of your questions and comments coming out today kind of show the inherent limitations of the science of learning when we're using it to think about the technology curriculum, and it offers something, but it sure doesn't tell you exactly what you're meant to do or how it's meant to work.
Aren't you meant to be the oracle? Please tell us what are we meant to do next lesson?
Goodness,
That's it, right? Or the science of learning generally. Yeah.
Yes.
Tell us our lesson plans, please.
And it's not going to do that. Malcolm, you are preaching to the converted. Absolutely. I think that there needs to be more support in PD to primary teachers, without a doubt. Yes.
Sorry, I just had to say that because I'm being a bit like, yeah, devil's advocate. Yeah, we definitely need to be doing that.
Yeah. And I think that comes into the comment that's come in as well about, you know, there's so much that you need to build in your 7 and 8s to develop that knowledge base so that they are ready for secondary school. Yes.
By the looks of it, this may be our last question.
Quick final question. Do you have anything to say about the method of learning that we get often in high schools of a student being an hour in one subject, jumping to another, jumping all over the place, as opposed to having longer periods of time in one area?
Yes. So again, I actually don't think that there's any easy answer to that. And I do think to some degree, I'm so sorry. Apparently there's a volcano and the lava's coming down in my household. So I think that it sometimes can differ depending on the subject, and it can differ depending on the students. And it can also differ depending on the age of the students and how you structure your teaching and what you're going to do. So one of the things we know is that the amount of time that we can concentrate on really intense learning is limited, that's not infinite. But at the same time, there are some times when we are engaging in particular learning tasks where having an extended period of time to engage in those is incredibly valuable. I would probably guess that having extended periods of time in technology can often be quite valuable, and potentially is more valuable for technology as opposed to some other subjects where actually it's easier if you have a shorter period of time. You know, so for instance, if you look at some of the research on learning foreign languages, actually a little often is far more effective than long periods of time, you know, once or twice a week. So you've got a difference between different subjects. You've also got a difference in terms of different students. So no easy answer to that, I'm afraid.
Ruth, I think Ruth is sneaking one. If we can sneak one more in there.
She shared a piece of research by NZGTTA.
Okay, there we go. Well, if there are no further questions, Nina, thank you so much for your time, for coming in and presenting to us, for taking our questions and giving us the opportunity to listen to you. It's always very engaging hearing you talk and having it to mull over the things that you bring up and how they apply to our learning area as well.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you this afternoon. And thank you also for your comments and questions. Very much appreciated.
Thanks so much. Ka kite.
Ka kite.